So welcome to Churchill. Each player takes the role of one of the big three during World War II. We compete against each other for victory points, but we also need to work together to be able to fight the Axis powers. A player that accumulates an enormous amount of victory points may end up losing the game by driving the other two players into an alliance against their nation. To win, therefore, you must attain the highest number of victory points whilst winning by a close margin. The victory conditions reflect the tensions and struggles existing within a fragile alliance as the powers prosecute the war to its conclusion whilst making efforts to shape the post-war world to their nation's advantage. So the game map, as you can see, is divided into two major displays, each aligned to one of the two primary phases of each turn. Phase 1 is the conference phase, Phase 2 being, wait for it, the war phase. The conference display is where most of the interaction between the players is going to take place and is represented by that circular conference table. In the middle of the display is the zero space, and then radiating from that center are the tracks for each of the nations with respect to their leader's chair at the end of the track. The military display is divided into the European and Pacific theaters with the Axis countries at the center of each. There are a number of front tracks divided into front spaces, spiraling into each of the Axis powers, although I do want to point out that the Mediterranean front stops short of Germany, and the Arctic theater doesn't have a front, it's kind of its own animal up top. The current position of Allied forces along each of these fronts is represented by front markers. The next empty space ahead of the front marker is known as the entry space, and that's really important to remember because entry spaces aren't where it comes in, it's the next available space as you see there. If one or more of the fronts enters an Axis country, that power surrenders. When both Axis powers surrender, the game ends. Failing that, the game ends at the conclusion of the 10th conference. There are conditions under which Japan will surrender even if not invaded by a front marker. You guys may remember back in 1945 when the war ended by the Americans dropping the atomic bomb, and that's what's represented possibly in this game. Adjacent to the front tracks are spaces for countries and colonies where we can place our clandestine networks and political alignment markers. The former, i.e. the clandestine networks, represent our nation's support for occupied resistance movements, and the latter are formal support for governments in exile, and both are going to be worth victory points at the end of the game. There's also the aforementioned A-bomb and its status track, where the U.S. advances their research marker in hopes of deploying it against Japan, whilst the Soviet Union, hi, that's me, the Manhattan Spiring marker represents the efforts to steal this technology. There's also the score track over there. Now, we are not going to really use the score track except for the end of the game. There are going to be a couple of in-game scoring in which timing matters, which player got here first type thing. Those things we're going to go ahead and peg, but otherwise it's going to be a bit monotonous and drag out the stream too long to be able to go through the scoring of every minutia as it happens, etc. And most players kind of do the same. The offensive support markers. Now, those are going to be placed on entry spaces to increase the fighting strength of fronts as we attempt to advance, whilst the naval support markers are placed in the theater boxes, and those are required for entering amphibious spaces or these spaces with anchor markers on them. If you lack sufficient naval support, which is usually going to be 3, however, there is the Normandy, which is going to be 5 spaces, you can't advance into an amphibious space no matter how strong your front is. Now, over on the other side of the table, or the other end of the board, there are spaces next to the conference table where each of the issues that we're going to potentially be arguing are stored until they're nominated for discussion during the conference phase. These are going to be grouped by type. During the game, we're going to receive production markers. Now, these production markers, or production in general, is a spendable resource which is used in 3 different ways. Or I guess we're going to be in Europe mostly 3 different ways. To place offensive and or naval support markers, that's number 1. To convert political or military issue markers into clandestine network and political alignment markers, or to enhance the A-bomb research going up on that track. Note that the current status of the 3 bipartisan issues, those are also tracked here in what some folks have lovingly called the love triangle over there. So as you can see on the board. Now, each of the players has a deck of 21 staff cards plus 1 leader card. Now, the U.S. has 2 leaders because Roosevelt may die at some point in the game, and Truman comes into play. Each leader has a strength of 7, as you can see in the top left-hand corner. In addition to that, they have a special ability or an attribute, as you can see there. Then they have either a penalty of some sort. If it's Roosevelt or Churchill, it's going to be a health-related, and if you're Stalin, it's just straight-up paranoia. At the bottom of each of these cards is a national characteristic, which is a special rule breaker for each of the 3 nationalities. Now, the remaining staff cards each represent a historical character with a strength value and text that describes their special abilities and or penalties for use. These cards are also used during the conference phase to nominate, advance, and debate issues. We're going to do more on this later. However, there is one special card that each of us has that has a star instead of a number value. We're going to have to roll a d6 to determine what that number is when we choose to play that card. But that kind of gives you the anatomy of one of the cards, or each of the cards that's going to be in each of our decks. Any questions thus far? All right? Now, getting back over onto the conference side of things, there's a semi-random deck of conference cards, and one's going to be revealed at the start of each turn. They each contain events which must be enacted before we begin the conference, and we're going to resolve those top to bottom. The number of conference cards used is determined by the scenario we choose to play. So there are 3 scenarios, mostly. There's training, which is 3 conferences, the tournament, which we're playing tonight, which is 5 scenarios, or the campaign, which is the whole kit and caboodle, which is 10. Now, one of the most unusual aspects of the game is the way that victory is defined. There is a victory point schedule which shows how many victory points we earn for advancing on fronts, the Axis surrender, A-bomb research, political alignment and clandestine networks placement, winning conferences, etc. There's a whole bunch of things that we're going to get points for. However, the player with the most victory points doesn't necessarily win the game. There are 3 possible endings to the game. If both Axis powers have surrendered, and the difference between the highest and lowest scores is 15 or less, whoever scores the most victory points wins. That's pretty standard, that's pretty normal. However, if the Axis has surrendered, and the difference between the highest and lowest score is greater than 15, things get a little wonky, and then the second place winner may be able to win the game. However, if neither Axis power has surrendered, and the Allies have lost the game. Now, there is another scenario in which we roll dice and see who won. But honestly, if we don't defeat Germany and we don't defeat Japan, we lose the game collectively. And the rest, honestly, just doesn't matter. All right? Any questions on that? All right, so let's continue on now. As I already mentioned, each game turn or each conference is divided into 2 phases. The conference phase and the military phase. Now, normally I would go through how a turn works. But in this case, we are going to start with the military phase, which is the second phase. The reason for that, you have to have context on what all this stuff is to understand why we're doing the things that we're doing over here. So I'm actually going to go over the military phase first. And honestly, it's the quickest phase, so let's go ahead and go into that. The first thing that happens in the military phase is that each player has the opportunity to place clandestine network markers. We get one for free, but we may gain more during the conference phase by winning political military issues or pol-mil issues, as you can see there. Whoever has the most markers is going to place all of theirs first. There can be no more than 2 clandestine network markers on any country or colony, and only one color can be there. So you're either going to place markers where you have 0 or 1 marker already, or you use one of your markers to essentially negate another player's marker as so. Then, after that's done, we do much the same thing with the political alignment markers. We get these from conference cards, leader and staff cards, and those aforementioned pol-mil issues. Again, we start with whoever has the most. There can be no more than 1 political alignment marker per country or per colony, as you see out here. You can either place your own marker if there are none, or use 1 marker to again remove an opponent's marker. However, you can only place or remove markers in countries and colonies where you already have 1 or more clandestine network markers. There may be additional restrictions on how and where you can place and remove political alignment markers depending on the current status of the various global issue tracks, which we will talk about when we get over to there. Finally, we move on to combat, which honestly, pretty streamlined and very, very abstracted. The Axis units are going to be deployed to the various fronts according to the script that's shown on the board and occasionally by a die roll. Then each front marker must attempt to advance 1 space, providing that 1, it has sufficient naval support to enter an amphibious space, and and 2, any conditional issues have been allocated as appropriate. In other words, Normandy and Manchuria specifically have little rule breaker spaces or prerequisites that are required for those. To determine if a front marker advances, we're going to compare its strength to the strength of the Axis units opposing it. Each front marker has a base strength of 2 and receives an additional +2 for each offensive support marker allocated to it. Those offensive support and naval support markers are each purchased with production markers, but we'll cover that later, okay? Just know that each offensive marker or offensive support marker adds +2 on top of the base count of 2 on them. Then we subtract 2 for each Axis unit facing the front marker. If the adjusted strength, which the final total, whatever that is, if it's 0 or less, well, the advance just straight fails. If it's greater than 0, then we're going to go ahead and roll a d10. If the roll is equal to or less than the adjusted strength, hey, congrats, the front marker advances 1 space. If the adjusted strength is 10 or more, however, before the roll, the front marker has a chance to break through, in other words, to move 2 spaces in 1 turn, provided the second space is not amphibious. To achieve this, first you modify the die roll by +1 for each point of modified strength over 10. If the modified die roll is 10 or more, hey, congrats, it's a breakthrough, advance 2 spaces, provided it's not an amphibious assault. All right, so let's go ahead and go through a quick example, which we kind of pantomimed already, as you see. So each of these markers has a plus or is worth 2. And each of these offensive support adds 2 to the die roll. And we need to roll as it is. If there were not these armies, the Imperial Japanese Army units, that would be 2, 4, 6, 8. We would need to roll an 8 or less. Congrats, we would advance. However, there are a couple of army units. Each army unit is going to negate one of those offensive support markers. So now we are left with just the base of 2 plus 2, meaning we need to roll a 4 or less to advance. Well, that just failed. Womp womp, we do not advance. So what would happen at that point, whether it fails or succeeds, these will come back to where they're home, whether it's in Japan or in Germany. All offensive support markers are removed from the board. It's important to note that naval support is not moved or removed at the end of a combat. However, we're about to talk about that. Now, you're going to note that there are certain spaces on the board that are marked as kamikazes, all right, as you can see here. This means that as soon as a front marker enters that space, the associated theater marker, so if this advances here, a kamikaze is going to take out one of these naval units. So it's going to go from 3 down to 2, as you see like that. So in order for this to even advance any further, there must be 3 naval, meaning there must be more naval units that get added onto that space. Also, some spaces have victory points listed. At the end of the game, if an Axis country has entered by a USSR front marker, hey, congrats, the Soviet player earns 8 victory points for entering an Axis country. If an Axis country is entered by a combined UK and or US front marker, the UK and US marker each get 8 victory points for each Axis country entered in that way, regardless of however many front markers entered the country, meaning those are not cumulative. For any front marker that doesn't enter an Axis country by the end of the game, victory points are earned for the furthest and only the furthest space, which is reached along its theater track for only the player indicated on that space. So for instance, if the UK player advances to here but doesn't quite make it into Japan, they're going to score 5 points at the end of the game. Whereas if the US player has not entered the Philippine space, meaning it hasn't reached here, it's somewhere before that, then the UK and the Soviet player each get 3 victory points as shown on the board. All right. Now, I did not talk about the Imperial Japanese Navy. When these get allocated, they're just going to take care of one of the naval markers that's out here on the board, and then they're going to come back. It's important to note that there are 2 Imperial Japanese Navy navies. Only one of them can ever be on the board at one time. All right. A final thing to be aware of during the military phase is that when a front marker advances, any countries or colonies which are now newly behind the front, each one has a clandestine network marker removed for each player not represented on the front marker. In other words, combined UK and US fronts remove a Soviet clandestine network marker, Soviet front remove UK and US clandestine network markers. So that is why it may behoove you to have 2 in a given area, because now it only removes 1, and oh hey, look, you still have a marker in that location. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Any real questions on the military phase?
No.
That pretty much covers this entire half of the board. Awesome, we're halfway home, okay? So a moment for a drink. All right, now that we've seen what happens on the military phase, we can return to standard turn order, which always begins with the conference phase. We start with the agenda segment. First thing that's going to happen is we're going to reveal the conference card and then follow what it says, top to bottom, as you can see on it. Then each player is going to deal themselves 7 staff cards before choosing and simultaneously revealing 1 staff card each. So it could be something along the lines of like so. Then any text on those staff cards is ignored right now. Only the strength value is considered. The highest strength value card gets to pick a single issue and then add it to the table, moving it along the owner's track a number of squares equal to the difference between the highest and lowest value staff card just played. Now, this is where the UK national characteristic comes into play. For the purposes of the agenda issues only, the UK player increases his staff card by a strength of 1. So to conclude the agenda segment, then all 3 players are going to select 2 issues and place them in the 0 space. But let's go ahead and explain this, give it as the example is shown. So right now, the UK played a 5. Well, because of his special ability, that's actually a 6. He chooses one of those, then he figures out who played the lowest value. Well, I played the lowest value, which is 1. 6 minus 1 is 5. That's going to go ahead and give him a head start on that 1 issue for 5. Then, starting with the player to the left who won that, we're going to go ahead and discard these cards as well. Then, starting with the player to the left, which in this case is the Soviet player, I would choose any 2 of the issues to then place onto the table. The US player, Jess, in this case, would choose any other 2 issues out there to place out on the board or out onto the main center stage. And finally, the conference or the agenda winner will place 2 out there. All right, then we're ready to begin. Okay, so now we start the meeting segment. Starting with the player to the left of the agenda segment winner, we're going to take turns nominating issues. To nominate an issue, we're going to choose a staff card and pick an issue on the conference table. So for instance, if I choose to play this card here and I choose an issue out there, maybe the pole mill, check that, maybe it's a production. The US production one, I would then move it a number equal to the strength here, which is 2. However, if there is an attribute that applies, we also do that. This says if production issues plus 1 strength, so we move it there. Pretty simple there. So we move it towards my own chair a number of spaces equal to the strength of the card, plus or minus any modifiers. The card may also have supplementary text, which is followed regardless of the issue chosen. Now, when you nominate an issue, the player to your left then has an option to debate the issue. To do so, they play a card in the exact same way, but instead they move the issue back towards their chair that number of spaces. So in this case, Jess says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and debate the issue. So you'll see that the strength of her card was a 1, so it's going to move back towards her own chair. Now, if the player to my left debated that, the matter is ended and the next player has no chance to debate. However, if the first player declined to debate, then the second player may debate if they wish. Okay? And follows the exact same thing. So in this case, it would move 4, including the center space being 1 counting. And in addition to that, it would be if the UK production issue plus 1 strength, but it's not, it's the US production, so it doesn't apply. Easy enough. In addition to that, whenever a player exercises his option to debate, they put a pass marker on their discard pile or in front of them. This indicates that when it gets to that player's turn, they have an option to pass instead of nominating an issue, in order to preserve their hand of cards and basically be a stall action. However, the pass marker is removed after their next turn, so if you don't pass on your very next go, you missed your opportunity. Now, one last thing. If somebody plays a card in which the issue would make it all the way up to their chair, so for instance, as you see here, Churchill, that would move it all the way up to a 7. In this case, any player can still debate. However, because a leader was played, you can only debate other leaders with leaders. So that makes sense. So in this case, I couldn't debate with, say, Nikolai here. I would have to debate with Stalin to move it back. But let's say I chose to pass, or I chose not to debate, as did Jess. In that case, once that issue is settled, because it ended on a player's chair, that thing is now locked. What that means is that issue can no longer be debated and it is locked for that player. They're going to win that issue at the end of the conference, okay? In addition to that, as you can see here, Rayner used Churchill, which is his leader. You can only do so 1 time. He would then have to roll for any health check, as you can see there, and if it's possible, Churchill can die. Bad things can happen. However, you move his marker from active to inactive, meaning he cannot use his leader anymore during the rest of this conference. Okay? Now, there are two specific issues. The Second Front and the USSR declares war on Japan, which have an additional option when you nominate or debate them. Namely, normally, if you would pass through the zero space on the way towards your chair, you can choose to go ahead and stop at the zero space instead of progressing further. And the reason for that is, unlike other issues, those two conditional issues only trigger if they are on the zero space at the end of the conference. They don't happen if they are anywhere else. All right? Finally, as I mentioned earlier, be aware that instead of using a staff card, you can use your leader card once per conference to either nominate or debate an issue. However, to do this, you must first discard a staff card. All right? Thematically, if you put in a issue up for nomination, they're presenting it on behalf of their leader, so they step aside and now their leader steps in. Okay? And again, they become inactive, meaning the leader does, for the remainder of the conference. The only other way that a leader can get involved in a conference is in breaking ties, but this doesn't trigger any of their special effects, although it's still going to be marked as inactive. If no player chooses to break a tie with their leader, the U.S. player's national characteristic comes into play, and, well, hey, the U.S. breaks all ties, even if they're not involved, meaning they just choose who wins the tie in that case. All right? All right. And yeah, Churchill doesn't die. I think something negative happens for him, but whatever. Once all players have run out of staff cards, the meeting segment is over, and then we go into the decision segment. First, we determine who won the conference, namely, the player who won the most issues. You've won an issue if it's on your leader's chair or if it's on your nation's track at the end of a conference. The conference winner gains some amount of victory points, 3 or 5, depending on what country it is. Then the issues we just won are going to be enacted. On the backside of each issue, chat summarizes its effect, but we also have cheat sheets which go into more detail, which I'm sure we're going to use throughout the playthrough. 1 issues are enacted in a specific order, starting with the player to the left of the conference winner. So in this case, you see that Churchill and Stalin both won 2 issues. So if either of us uses our leader to break ties, great. We win that. We get to place one of the conference winners out there. However, if none of us choose to, and I should note that yes, also the Americans could play their leader to break the tie. If none of us plays a leader, the U.S. just dictates. She says, "Oh, you win the conference. Congrats." So let's say I won it, for lack of a better deciding factor on the tiebreaker. Starting with the player to the left of the conference winner, here we go. Step 1, the directed offensives. We place, these are placed in any entry space on a theater track. Later on, the indicated nation is forced to convert 2 of their production markers to support for that advance, which we'll talk about here shortly. Then the conditional issues. Either the Second Front or the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. If it ended on the zero space, that condition has been met, and this allows either the Western Front to attempt to advance to Normandy or the Far East Front to attempt to advance to Manchuria. To indicate it, we're going to put the issue on the entry space, and note that that doesn't end the current conference. If it doesn't end in the zero space, then ignore it, and it goes back onto the display, and hopefully next conference that might happen. Then we each receive production markers, so there's going to be 6 for the US, 4 for the UK, and 3 for the Soviet Union. However, a 4th one is possible if there are at least 3 naval support in the Arctic theater. Then additional production markers may be obtained from the conference card itself, as well as strategic materials issue. If that ended in the center of the table, everybody gets an extra production. Yay! If it ends on somebody's track, though, only yay for them. That team, if you will, i.e. the Soviet Union in this case, gets 1 extra production marker. Then we allocate that production. First, we have to meet any requirements dictated by the conference card. Then, if there's a directed offensive issue that's been placed on a theater track, that specified nation has to convert 2 of their production markers into support to help out whatever faction that is, and those are going to be placed on the entry space on that track. First, they convert it into naval support if the entry space is amphibious until there is sufficient naval support for an advance, then converting into offensive support all at a 1-to-1 ratio. Then, any remaining production markers can be spent however they want. More offensive and or naval support, again, 1-to-1 ratio for production equaling support. Then, 1 production marker per pole mill issue 1. Now, these issues don't do anything for the winner unless they allocate production to activate or trigger them. And you do that to convert them into a number of clandestine network and political alignment markers shown. So the first number would be the political markers, and the second number is the clandestine markers. Then, lastly, a production marker can be used to increase the A-bomb die roll. If anybody won the issue, okay, note that you can spend this production marker even if another player won the issue. So to advance here to help out that die roll, any of us can win that issue, or can try and boost that roll if we choose to. Then the commander of each theater as indicated on the board. So we have the Pacific Theater Command and we have the European Theater Command up top. Whoever is in command of that receives either 1 offensive or 1 naval support and places it in the theater they control, anywhere applicable. However, if anyone won a theater command issue, the winner of that theater command issue receives 2 support, again, any mix that they wish, and place them in the related theater. If a single player wins both theater command issues, as well as receiving 2 support for the European and 2 for the Pacific, they get 2 bonus that can be placed anywhere for a total of 6 if they win them both. Once all of the support has been placed, then the winner of each theater command chooses who commands that theater, either the UK or the US, never the Soviet Union. Which means that even if the UK won the Pacific Theater Command, they would get the 2 bonus support. However, if they choose to let the US have it, the US then would get 1 support of their choice to place in any of the various theaters in that region. Does that make sense? All right, we're almost done. Then, if anybody won the A-bomb research issue, then a D6 is rolled to see if the research progresses. Any player can use production to modify the die roll by 1 per production. To roll, it's a 4 or 6 for a success. If it's a 4 or a 6, the US marker is increased 1 step up until they reach the Trinity space, which means they have the A-bomb. If the Soviet Union, however, wins the issue, they automatically progress their spy ring 1 space, and then they roll for the US. Hey, congrats, we're team players. You advanced as well. The USSR just automatically advances 1 space. Now, those spaces are worth victory points at the end of the game. 3 points for every space for the USSR, 3 points for the UK and the US if they have reached the top spot, 3 bonus points for the Soviet Union if they haven't reached that space. Then, finally, if anybody won a global issue, they then choose one of the global issue markers adjacent to their leader's chair and move it 1 step towards them. Now, note, you see these neutral spaces in the center where they all start. Once one of those global issue markers has moved to either side, it will never go back to a neutral location. It will bounce between plus marker and plus marker between those 2 sides. Those are going to be worth victory points for each global issue nearer your own leader's chair than anybody else's at the end of the game. Then once all the issues are resolved, we then proceed back to that military phase as we covered earlier. That said, that's pretty much how you play Churchill.